61, Rock of Ages. Rock of Ages, left for me, let me hide myself in thee, where the water and the blood from thy wound, the side which flowed, me of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. Not the labors of my hands can fulfill thy lost demands. Could my zeal no rested know? Could my tears forever flow? All for sin could not atone. Thou must save and thou alone. Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to the cross I cling. Naked come to thee for dress, helpless low to thee for grace. Fell I to the fountain fly, watch me, Savior, or I die. While I draw this fleeting breath, when my eyes shall close in death, when I soar to worlds unknown, see me on thy judgment throne. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee.
Good morning and welcome to worship at Gethsemane United Methodist Church. We are glad you are here.
Hi everyone, this is a tune called I'm Forever Grateful.
Joy of my desire, all consuming fire, Lord of glory, Rose of Sharon, rare and sweet.
It's the end of the world as we know it. That song has been stuck in my head all week long. It's a song, The End of the World as We Know It. It's a song by REM. Now, the band's initials stands for Rapid Eye Movement. You know, that's the state our brains enter when we dream. And when the lead singer talked about this song, decades ago in the 80s or whatever, the before times, who cares about that long ago, he said that it was a collection of streams of consciousness, that this song, The End of the World as We Know It, is just moving through these different stages of awareness, like being awake, being asleep, watching television, just moving through life, and how in that movement worlds were ending. Have you ever experienced the end of the world? I recognize that that's a super weird and odd question, but I also remember when my world ended once. In 8th grade, I switched schools from Elk River to Big Lake. I was not excited. Not excited is a huge understatement for how I felt about this. For the entire first year that I was at Big Lake, I wore an Elk River hoodie and didn't make many friends. I wore it every day. And I probably didn't make a lot of friends because I wore the same hoodie every day, and 8th graders tend to smell bad. But switching schools was this huge interruption in my life, and I remember on the first day in Big Lake, this was before I was wearing the hoodie, it was probably day 2 that I started that, but I was wearing this like light blue See You at the Pole shirt. See You at the Pole is an event when all the Christian kids in the school would get in a circle around the flagpole and pray for the school. And maybe this experience I had on the first day of school was the reason I decided to wear a black hoodie for the rest of the year. But when I got to lunch at like 10:30 a.m., because that's when schools say it's lunchtime, I was struggling to open my chocolate milk. You know those little milk cartons with the folded spouts? They can be tricky. Sometimes they get stuck. Sometimes they get like weirdly flexible, and it's impossible to open them. And I ended up using too much force when I pulled it open, and the entire thing tipped forward and spilled all over my lunch tray and all over the front of my shirt and all over my pants. Now, if you were an observant person and saw me that day, you might have assumed that this new kid at school had an accident. And when you're in 8th grade, you are very aware of how people observe you. I spent the rest of the day walking around with a folder or a textbook in front of me trying to block this brown wet stain on my clothes, because if someone were to notice, I was sure it would be the end of the world. I never drank chocolate milk the same again after that day. My world was forever changed. I'm sure you've experienced this in your own life, in your own end of the world moment or memory in which your life changed forever. I asked my wife Amy this question, when did you experience the end of the world? And she told me a story that when she was in elementary school, she checked out a book on the Greek gods from her library, and she brought it home, and her dog ate the school book. Now, Amy was a very responsible and fearful child. Every movie she watched as a kid scared her, and so when her dog ate her school book, she knew her life was over. So she went and she gathered a bunch of food, she put it in her room, she locked the door, and she refused to come out. She called her friend on the phone and left a message stating, this is my only mode of communication now. I'm never going anywhere again. Amy was prepared to live her life as a hermit. Amy was experiencing the end of the world as she knew it. Now, this kind of end of the world has a different tone than the usual end of the world we sometimes think about. What I'm talking about is a very subjective, transitional, transformational experience that we go through as we learn things and mature. Now, the literal end of the world is what I think about when I'm talking about climate change or nuclear war. Some Christians really buy into this literal end of the world, the literal kind. They see the events that happen in the news as prophetic signs that the end is nigh. Some authors have really sold into it as well. When I was a kid, the Left Behind series became this huge franchise, and ideas like the rapture and plagues and horsemen became a leading theological framework for faith. Now, I'm not here to debunk anything or tell you to believe any one certain thing. I'm just here to figure out what Jesus meant when he said things about signs of the end of the age to the disciples. Then how those signs are interpreted in our own day and what Jesus' words mean for us 2,000 years later. And that's what I want to hold this morning as we read through our text. And as we hear Jesus talking about the end times, the fact that Jesus was talking to his closest disciples and how the different circumstances they were facing and the different circumstances Mark's audience was facing is truly unique and different from our own circumstances. And I think when we discover what Jesus was saying to his disciples and we discover what Mark was saying to his audience, we also get invited to be transformed and changed. Their world-ending experiences can cause us to transform as well. Our scripture lesson this morning is from Mark 13, 1 through 8. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" Jesus said, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains." For scripture in, among, and beyond us, thanks be to God. Now, Jesus had just finished preaching and teaching to all these different people at the temple. All these different groups and factions were coming up to Jesus, and he was telling them how it is. And now Jesus has left the temple, and he's up on this mountainside, and he's starting this long private discourse with Peter, James, John, and Andrew as they sit on the big hill that overlooks the temple. This is one of those late night heart-to-heart conversations, like you're all sitting around the dying fire. It's too late to put on another log, but you also don't want to end the conversation. That's the setting. That's the vibe that these guys are in. And this is where Jesus starts preparing his disciples for what is to come, for the end of their world. Because at this point in the story, their world revolves around the temple. Their faith, their community, their connection to Yahweh was all built on and centered around the temple system, which is exactly where our story starts this morning. The disciples are in awe of how grandiose the temple is, which is a known fact of the first century. King Herod had upgraded the temple in order to try to curry favor with the Jewish folks who lived there. They weren't a huge fan of King Herod because, he worked for the Romans. And so the temple was this magnificent, opulent building that he tried to build up so that people would like him. And it was truly awesome. To which Jesus replies, "Not one stone will remain on another." Kind of a downer there, Jesus. But we also have to remember that Mark's gospel was written right after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So this idea of the stones being torn down and burned literally just happened for the folks to hear or read this story. And so the disciples ask, when is this going to happen? When is the destruction of the temple going to go down? And then we only hear the beginning of Jesus' answer in our text this morning. Jesus talks about false prophets. He talks about wars, nation rising against nation, earthquakes, famine. These are the beginning of the birth pains. If we were to continue reading, we would hear Jesus talking about how the disciples will be handed over to the authorities. They will be flogged. Brother will betray brother to death, and father his child. There will be rebellions and divisions. Jesus says that those will be the days of distress, unequaled from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Jesus is talking about the darkest days in human history, the worst it has ever been or ever will be. Jesus also says, "Truly, truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all of these things have happened." Jesus is preparing his disciples for what's to come. Jesus is preparing them for his absence. He's preparing them for their persecution and for their suffering, because all of the things Jesus is describing are the types of persecution the disciples in the early church experienced for a couple hundred years. Their world was going to end, and he says all these things will happen in that generation. And so if we were to read this literally, we don't have too much to worry about, considering that generation passed a long time ago. It's onward and upward from here, right? It's all downhill. That was the worst time in human history. But I don't think we're meant to read this literally. We aren't meant to make a checklist of the things Jesus describes and see if we can find it out in the world. Because of course we will find it. All of these things have been happening before and after Jesus' ministry. There is always a person or groups of people experiencing suffering and persecution at any given moment in our world. There is always earthquakes, famines, or plagues somewhere. So then, what is Jesus telling his disciples? What is Mark telling his audience, if not this literal prophecy for the end of the world? Because Jesus himself said they would experience it, yet here we are 2,000 years later still talking about it. Jesus isn't talking about the end of the world. He is talking to the disciples about the end of their world. We have the church history. We see how the early church is formed and persecuted. The people reading this gospel just experienced a failed revolt against Rome and the destruction of the temple and the burning of Jerusalem. I've been to Jerusalem. I've seen the fallen stones. They're still sitting there. Jesus is telling his folks to be ready in the face of persecution, because for them it's the end of the world in a sense. And in the midst of all of that turmoil, they are to maintain their faith, maintain resilience, maintain the love of God and neighbor. Jesus is telling them that if they choose to follow him, their world will end. Their status quo will be disrupted. There is no going back. This is only the beginning. There is no going back. They are at the beginning of the birth pains. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean for the people trying to follow after Christ faithfully 2,000 years after the destruction of Jerusalem? Surely we haven't experienced interruption in our lifetime. Surely the world that we've known has never gone through transformation or change. Oh, wait. It's 2021. We've been in a pandemic for 20 months. And I'm preaching online to however many people watch this, when 3 years ago I was in a room preaching to 50 to 60 people on any given Sunday. We've been dealing with the increasing consequences of climate change. We've been trying to reconcile hundreds of years of institutional racism that has affected our politics, our community, and our schools. There is warfare, there is famine, there is floods, fires, and pandemics all over our world. What came up for you just now? What emotion was evoked? Was it fear? Was it worry? Was it anxiety? Was it uncertainty? Where do you feel it? I feel it in the pit of my stomach. I feel it in the tenseness of my shoulders. Suddenly the hair on the back of my neck is standing up just a little bit. I can imagine that this is the emotions that Peter, James, John, and Andrew felt as Jesus listed off all the suffering that they were about to endure for his sake. But what does this mean for us? I know I always get stuck looking at stuff from 30,000 feet in the air. These problems are too big. I can't stop climate change. I can't single-handedly disrupt systemic racism. How do I bridge the divide and animosity that is ravaging our communities? How do I reach people and bring others back? This is a question I've been seeing a lot, especially in pastor circles. This fear around people not coming back. In a recent article that she wrote, Carrie Nieuwhof talks about the kind of hopeful bargaining that pastors are experiencing. She writes, as churches reopened in a slow regional checkerboard pattern across the US and eventually around the world, the Great Return didn't happen. Admirably, most pastors kept hoping. If they're not coming back now, you told yourself, then people will come back in the fall, after Christmas, when the mask mandate is lifted, when most people are vaccinated, after the summer break, when all restrictions are lifted, once the kids are back in school full time. And now, almost 2 full years into the pandemic, with some states and regions having been open for a year or longer, the slow realization is finally happening. The great return to the church has become the great realization. Maybe they're not coming back. Not now, not tomorrow, not ever. Carrie Nieuwhof said the thing that a lot of people are afraid to say. In the rest of the article, she goes into why the Great Return isn't happening, but more importantly, she goes into some of the ideas of what we can do. And that is to embrace the people around you, to find ways to engage the community, to grieve the losses and celebrate the joys. She says the past is gone, the future is here. We need to move forward, not backward. Our pre-pandemic world has ended. We collectively have experienced the end of the world as we know it. Our lives changed, our communities changed, our churches changed. The way we walk through and shop in the grocery store has changed. I now have a habit of putting on sanitizer every time I sit down in my car. We have shared an experience with Peter, James, John, and Andrew. They experienced an end of the world that sent them out into Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. We experienced the end of the world that sent us into hibernation. And now that we're coming out, we have new habits. We spent a year in our houses and we're coming out with new habits. About 10 months ago, before vaccinations rolled out and we just experienced one of the darkest moments of the pandemic, a Catholic speaker named Dan Salucci gave a talk titled, "What if they don't come back?" He was predicting 10 months ago the experience and the fear that Carrie Nieuwhof just wrote about last week. And in his talk, he embraces this question of what if. He talks about how the church needs to do 3 things. To name the fear, to ask the questions differently, and reflect on our answers. Name the fear, ask the questions differently, and reflect on our answers. In his talk, he says, so often leadership is about asking the right questions, and so often as a church, I'm afraid we ask the wrong ones. We ask what if to protect instead of progress. We ask what if to mitigate risk instead of stimulate possibility. What if we offend someone? What if no one shows up? What if the media shows up? What if we close? What if they leave? My friends, these are perfectly logical, pragmatic, responsible questions. questions we would be insane not to ask, except that we are Christians. So often we ask questions as if we are the audience, not the actor. We ask questions that deny the incredible potential that the Lord has placed in each one of us. We ask questions that deny the incredible potential that the Lord has placed in each one of us. If you have ever sat on a board or a committee of any kind, you are probably familiar with these kinds of questions. What if we tried something and failed? What happens when our world ends? When the bricks of our institutions are metaphorically demolished, where not even one stone will be left on another? What if we can't go back to normal? What if people never come back? Let's name that fear. Let's name that fear. Then let's begin to ask the questions differently. What if we went forward? What if we tried new things and failed? What if we took those failures as a lesson and grew from them? My fellow Methodists, we have experienced a destruction of sorts, and we're still in the midst of it in a lot of ways. And we weren't destroyed by Rome, but by the divisions and sickness that has ravaged our world these last 20 months. And now we have come down from the 30,000 feet view and have to ask the question, what if? Jesus told the disciples to be ready, to be watchful, and that the birth of the church was going to be a painful experience. They were experiencing the first pangs of that 2,000 years ago, and we are still experiencing them today as God's kingdom continues to crash into our world. And just like the disciples, we are thrust into a world we don't understand. The disciples were thrown into a world they didn't understand after the temple was destroyed, and we too are entering a ministry field that we do not yet understand. A ministry field with different needs than the ones we knew growing up. A ministry field that requires our faith to be adaptive, dynamic, resilient, humble, and able to admit when it was wrong. I'll end this morning with another quote from Dan Salucci. So why not ask, what if? And why not answer it with more possibility? What if we wrote a new story? Salvation history began before us and will extend countless generations beyond us. We are not even a chapter in this great epic. Maybe we get a sentence. But this is our sentence. Now we might want to ask the Lord why he gave us this sentence. But like what we have done with those who have come before us, others will one day read our sentence. And they too will ask, what if? What if I lived during that pandemic? Or what if I faced those challenges? What if I had their mission? What do we want them to read in our sentence? What if they read about a time where we took risks for the sake of the gospel? What if they read about a time defined by what Francis says is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything? What if the story we write included each and every one of us bringing one person back? Just one. And what if we didn't stop there? What if we continued with one of us bringing one person for the first time? My friends, what if there was a moment where the whole world was wondering at the very same time where to find hope? What if there was a moment where the whole world was unsure of what to believe, where to find truth? What if there was a moment when schedules were put on hold, habits were broken, people were desperate for real relationship, real presence? Man, wouldn't that be a tremendous opportunity if we had something to offer? What if we had something to offer? The most important question is not what if they don't come back. The most important question is what if God is calling me to something greater? we know God is. So maybe the real, most important question is, how will I respond? Amen.
Hi everyone, this is a tune called Great is Thy Faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Summer and winter and springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in their courses above, join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and the peace that endureth, thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me.
Thank you for joining us today. God send you, the Spirit fill you, Christ go with you, and you with Christ always and everywhere. Go in peace.